All right, welcome to TYT Interviews. We're going to have what I hope is one of the most interesting interviews we've ever done. It's with Sam Harris. He has a BA in philosophy from Stanford, a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA. You might be familiar with some of his books, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and Future of Reason, Letter to a Christian Nation, The Moral Landscape, Lying Free Will, and now his most recent book, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. Now, Sam, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk.
I really appreciate you coming in. It's going to be an interesting conversation, as I said, for a number of reasons. There are a lot of things that we agree on. I would say at least 90% of our views are probably similar, if not identical. And I think some people might be surprised by that. And there's some that we disagree on. And actually, the more that I've read your stuff, the more I realized the degree of our differences. Right. So that'll be interesting to talk about.
I'm starting to feel quite old now because stuff that I remember being quite recent, like political controversies or online debates, actually turn out to be like years old. And I guess that's just what happens in your 20s. You kind of lose track of time. So Sam Harris debated Cenk Uygur on TYT in October 2014. So I was just about to turn 19, but I remember this happening. And it's actually part of the backstory to Dave Rubin. Part of the reason he wanted to go independent is because he was disgusted by the way that Cenk and TYT treated Sam Harris, and him being a big Sam Harris simp, obviously had Sam Harris on his own show after he left and everything. But at the time, the widespread acceptance was Sam Harris utterly destroyed Cenk liberal Uygur, who just could not compete on this high level of ideas with Sam Harris. And I probably thought the same back in the day. Like, when you watch the debate, Sam Harris comes across better. But as I've gotten older, and a lot of the bad things that people said about Sam Harris back in the day have been vindicated by time, you go back and watch something like this, and your opinions start to shift a bit. So what I wanted to do today was go through some of the points of the debate. It was 3 hours long, so I've got a list of notes, and we're going to talk about various points. Talk about where I disagree with Sam Harris, talk about the points where Cenk is the strongest, and talk about my own responses to all these things. So today's video is brought to you by Ground News. You guys will know I like to reference and cite, various different articles in my videos, and you will often see me analyze the political biases or slant these outlets have to see if we can totally trust what they're reporting. If you aren't from, a journalism or academic background like myself, it can often be hard to tell what outlet slants which way, and how this might overall affect their coverage of a story. So this is why I'm excited to partner with Ground News, an app that makes staying informed and staying generally sane really, really easy. So Ground News is a news comparison platform that will show you how the big news stories are being covered by multiple sources, and it gives you the full story, enabling you to make your own conclusions. It has this really interesting blind spot feature that enables you to identify news that isn't being covered by sources in your bubble, helping you to see stories you wouldn't otherwise see. You guys know I'm a big proponent of being taught, critical thinking and media literacy. And I feel Ground News is an app that will help you develop these skills further. It's an indispensable tool for those who want to understand their own biases and understand the biases of others. You guys will know many political commentators, such as myself, get their videos constantly demonetized for covering serious issues. So please support Ground News for being a company that makes an indispensable product and is also willing to support political YouTubers like myself. Click on the link in the description to download the app. Also, if you want to follow me on social media, join the Discord, check out the Patreon, all that stuff, that is in the description. Thanks so much for helping me get to 30k subs in the last month or so. We're chugging along to 35. I think we're halfway there. Every 5k we get a new chocolate orange. Help me build the pyramid. Second channel, Kavernacle Extra, where I post all my live streams as well. So like I said, this debate was 3 hours long, and in my nice little Kavernacle notebook, which my girlfriend bought for me, I have lots of notes, and just pages and pages, whatever. Pages and pages of notes. And basically this video hopefully will be under an hour. But what I can't do is play the clip in front of me and then respond to it directly. So I'm relying on my notes, which I've made over the last 2 days. But I think I remember it well enough where I can respond to the main points. Now, There are loads of things I don't talk about, and there are loads of things I'm going to omit from this video just because either I don't feel like it's worth, dwelling on, and I don't think it's worth, maybe talking about today and everything. And if you've never seen it, go watch it yourself. Now, my main opinion is that I now, having watched this, agree more with Cenk Uygur, but the main problem, I think, with this debate is that Cenk just does not come across well because he basically says a lot of stuff and responds to Harris's points and then pivots somewhere else, and not saying everything he says is wrong, but it's not the greatest debate for one side having their case, the other side responding. Cenk interrupts a lot as well, so it's not the best thing. I think where he's strongest in this debate is when he talks about Israel and Palestine, which we're going to get to. But to start off, I want to talk about the desert island concept. So Sam Harris's argument here, his theoretical argument, and it goes to a problem I have with him in general, he talks about a desert island of humans who have no contact with the outside world and have no religion. And he talks about what would happen if you gave them Islam or gave them Buddhism. Basically saying he would not be surprised if he gave them Islam, but they would be living like ISIS.
This is my claim. If we found a totally isolated people on a desert island and we gave them the canon of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, the biography of Muhammad, and said, here, this is all you need to know, okay? Live by these principles. And then we came back in 1,000 years, and they were living like ISIS. There would be not much basis for surprise. Now, if we gave them the Pali canon, the canon of the teachings of the Buddha, and came back in 1,000 years, and they were living like ISIS, there'd be reason to be flabbergasted. There'd be no obvious connection
now
between.
You brought up like 8 things I got to respond to, but
Okay,
let me.
Now, I think just this little scenario sums up a lot of my problems with Sam Harris, and he does this throughout the debate. In the theoretical world, in the made-up world, this argument can make sense. You give a group of humans who have like no concept of the outside world on a desert island a religion, it's very plausible that they could maybe end up living like ISIS. But I don't really understand how this helps in any way, because Islam was not created in a vacuum. Islam actually had a bit of a battle over what its true interpretation was. And there's debates over whether Muslims originally included the Abrahamic stuff about, all the Jewish figures and all the Christian figures, or if Muslims did this later, after Muhammad. And also Muhammad's political conquest and the start of Islam as a religion is just so entrenched in the history and politics of that region of the world, you can't separate it. And that is for all religions now. Religions do not develop in a vacuum. Even if you are accepting a new religion, that is not devoid from context, from socio-economics, from cultural factors, from political factors. So even using this example, to me, to prove that maybe Islam is more inherently violent is pretty ridiculous, because it will never exist in this context. So why are we even playing this game? So a point Sam Harris goes on to focus on just after this is that Islam can be a death cult because of the promises of martyrdom, and this is what makes Islam unique compared to other religions.
And also this notion of paradise and martyrdom is the huge variable among jihadists.
Yeah.
It's the willingness, it's the eagerness to die, to get and to not only get into paradise yourself, but to get everyone you care about in after you, to get past that velvet rope in the sky. That is at the center of this death cult behavior.
So even if I were to grant you that, then we go to the issue of Christianity, which has all of the barbaric stuff that's in the Old Testament, right? And then, of course, conveniently, Christians will cherry pick and say, well, we don't agree with that part of the Old Testament, but we love Genesis, right? So it has all that barbaric stuff. It's in the Bible. And then in the latter verses, it says, oh, by the way, God is going to come back and kill you all, okay? First, you have the messianic situation. If you have the worst of all worlds, you have to convert everybody, okay? And if you don't convert everybody, God will kill you all, right? So, and you should look forward to that, because your beloved Lord is going to come and vacuum you into the sky. Yeah. So if anyone is the most dangerous, doesn't it make sense that it is the people looking forward to Armageddon, where we all die? Well, and by the way, actively try to make that happen.
And he's saying it's the eagerness, it's the willingness to die for their religion, which makes Islam uniquely dangerous. But again, we're going to get into later how Sam Harris doesn't actually understand history all that well. During the First Crusades, the Pope promised anyone who died on the crusade, or even on the way to the crusades, if you died in Europe traveling there, you would be a martyr for Christianity. And as a martyr, you've died for your religion, your sins are going to be forgiven. And if you were a knight who fought in wars against fellow Christians, you were going to go to purgatory. You weren't going to hell. So these guys became martyrs. They died for their religion, and a lot of them were happy to go and die for their religion. Yes, they didn't kill themselves or blow themselves up, but the concept of martyrdom is not unique. And Cenk also makes a good point about Christians waiting for Armageddon. Christians aren't only waiting for Armageddon. Like in the videos I've made lately, white evangelical Christians in the government, like Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration, were actively trying to create a war between Israel and Iran because they believe these are the necessary conditions for Armageddon to occur. This sounds a bit like a death cult. This sounds like guys who happily want to die for their faith. So again, I think Sam Harris's problem is that he lives in the theoretical world where, because Islam is the only religion that maybe promotes this stuff, and you can see a link between those words and the actions, but you can also see how these evangelical Christians believe a similar thing, and they will do that as well. And Cenk also brings up about kamikazes and other Buddhist groups who do this stuff as well. So I think Cenk actually wins in this point. I just don't think the way he articulates it is very good. And I'm not going to dwell too much on this point, but during the interview, Sam Harris basically says that given the right conditions, he'd be worried more about Christianity.
Now, again, that doesn't entitle us to be less than precise about the differences between Christianity and Islam. And I will grant you that there are circumstances in which, given the right conditions, all of a sudden I'd be more worried about Christian dogma than Muslim dogma or Islamic dogma.
I believe the decline of new atheism and the intellectual dark web is because Islamic extremism has become less of an issue for Western countries, where Christian nationalism and far-right Christian nationalism at that, in America, in Poland, in Hungary, in the UK, in all these places has risen. But Sam Harris doesn't actually seem as worried about this stuff as he did about Islam back in 2014. And now, to show ignorance of history that Sam Harris has, so basically he goes on to talk about Islam needing to be reformed and how Islam has historically been spread by Muslim people.
The Quran is a much shorter, much more streamlined book, and it is it has a central message which is very much in harmony with the example of Muhammad. It is not the central message of the Quran, arguably, certainly a central message, is you should spread this one true faith to the ends of the earth, and you spread this by conquest, not conversation. It is convert or die, or if you happen to be a person of the book, you can live as a dhimmi. Now that is...
So Sam, that's a very important distinction though, because the Quran says don't touch the Christians and the Jews, they're people of the book. And of course, it's also wildly contradictory in different parts. And there's a very legitimate case to be made that when they talk about infidels, they're talking about the pagans of the time.
Okay.
And so...
But that's cold comfort to 1.2 billion Hindus who are polytheists and just completely beyond the pale by the light of this doctrine, right? Mm-hmm. So... but I want to deal with your points.
But the Christians want to convert them too, and if they don't convert them, it doesn't matter because they're all going to get blasted by God at the end.
Okay, but that you know to be a fiction, and that's very different than waging war in this life against these people.
So basically, that Islam has been spread by conquest, and mainly conquest, which is something I sort of reject, because yes, this did happen. Islam was spread, just like Christianity, by conquest. But it wasn't only by conquest, and he talks about Muslims forced converting people, which obviously happened, but he seems to ignore that Christians both spread their faith through conquest. Not only that, they forced converted people. So there were numerous crusades, not just against the Muslims in the Holy Land, but against various Christian sects. There were wars between Christian groups that felt like they were being oppressed, like the Hussites in Bohemia, who wanted to have their own brand of Christianity. And I think the main part is Sam Harris must have a real ignorance of the history of Spain, because the Reconquista happened, and what did Spain do? It force converted nearly the whole Muslim population, and when that wasn't enough and they still weren't satisfied, they actually ethnically cleansed the whole of Spain and put all the Muslims onto boats and sent them to North Africa. This happened in 1609. I'm going to get back to this a bit later. Now, Cenk and Harris go into talking about the Ottoman Empire, and Cenk was saying, well, you're saying that, the Muslims have this ideology which is about conquest and everything, but the Ottoman Empire actually let, various Christian and Jewish groups live in their empire, and obviously not benevolently, but they treated the Jewish people better than the Christians ever did. Sam Harris thinks this is a revisionist history, and he basically says that Christianity was only really bad in the Middle Ages, and Islam is still bad today.
Muslims clearly can do that to some degree, right? This history you allude to, this is increasingly we're getting a politically correct and romanticized history of the ages of Muslim tolerance and how good life was for Jews and Christians under Islam when the Christians were barbarians in the Middle Ages and launching aggressive wars of conquest against the crusades against the Muslim world. What you had were Christian barbarians attacking a highly cultivated and otherwise peaceful Muslim world. Okay, this is largely a fantasy. It's largely cooked up in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and Benjamin Disraeli. I mean, the idea of Andalusia and things being great for Jews.
No. So that's also 50-50. Well, if people talk about a utopia, that's crazy. They conquered people.
We're not going to that here, but I'm just saying that people should be suspicious of how good life was.
The Ottomans did rescue hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Inquisition. It was largely for probably business reasons and the empire and the maintenance, but they said, we'll take the Jews off your hands. That's a fact, right?
Yes, but the problems continued, and Maimonides, it's often said that Maimonides recognized how great life was in the Muslim world, but this is not true. He was in continuous flight from persecution, and he referred to Muhammad, I think, as the madman. So he was not a fan of Islam. In any case, the comparison with the height of Christian insanity in the Middle Ages is obviously, of course, life was terrible for Jews in medieval Christianity. So you have a civilization that is completely deranged by its religiosity, where people are being burned alive for heresy and witchcraft, and you're talking about ages of the starkest ignorance, where people, the bubonic plague is ravaging Europe, and all the Christians can think to do is start cutting the tongues out of blasphemers, because they have no idea of how people get sick, and they just think blasphemy must be the cause, right? So you're dealing with a completely deranged religious world, and yes, then by comparison with Christianity at that point, Islam looks rather good, but. Again, and we're not going to adjudicate a different interpretation of history here, but I'm just saying that there we have a romanticized history about how good life was under Islam, and how jihad and fundamentalism is somehow a new phenomenon. It's just the Wahhabis who were jihadists, and we've had 1,400 years of jihad. So that is a fact of. Jihad is not an invention of the 20th century.
Sam Harris frames it as like a never-ending jihad with Islam and stuff. But like I mentioned, the final solution for the Moriscos in Spain, the first modern-style final solution in European history, was done in 1609. This is not the Middle Ages. This is not the medieval period. This is the early modern period. And of course, they force-converted the Jews in the 1300s as well. So this barbarism from Christianity isn't something that only existed in the medieval times, because starting in the 1400s, they also used Christianity to justify the African slave trade. You can actually read extracts of priests who worked in the Vatican who said it made them very sad to see these African families split up, but they were happy because now these pagans had found God's light and entry into heaven. Again, this sounds pretty barbaric, and this went on in some countries till nearly 1900. From 1400. I had my ladies and gentlemen, we got him moment when I heard Sam Harris talk about the First Crusade. Now, in my history degree, I did the First Crusade. I've read a lot of books about the Crusades and the Templars and all this stuff. Something I'm very passionate about and interested in. But he showed his right-wing revisionist history bias when he talked about the Crusades being a defensive war.
So Sam, I don't romanticize it at all. And of course, back then, the things that happened would shock our conscience today, right? But when you compare the Muslim empire to the Christian empire back then, or the Christian, it's hard to call them empires, but fiefdoms, etc.
Christendom, yeah.
Right. Well, the Muslims were comparatively more liberal. They built libraries, whereas the Christians didn't, right? They cared more about science and math than the Christians did.
They were
comparatively
spreading their faith by jihad, and the Crusades were a response to 300 years of jihad. I mean, the Crusades were not just, the Christians didn't wake up one day saying, let's just conquer the world. They were dealing with continuous attacks from the Muslim world.
There you go again. So like, I feel like when I hear you talking about Israel, when I hear you writing about it, or I read you writing about it, it always feels like, well, it's always the Muslims' fault, right? So the Christians, they did the Crusades because they were provoked by the Muslims.
To be fair, Cenk does not actually challenge him on this, but Sam Harris says the Crusades were a response to 300 years of Islamic aggression. And I've made, I think, 2 or 3 videos on this stuff about how this is revisionist history. And people often like to do this where they take the Arab invasion of Spain and battles in France with Christians, and then they lump that together with the Ottomans fighting the Austrians in like the 1600s and say this is like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of Islamic expansion. Like, Islam is a unified monolith, for one thing, or that these things are all the same. So let's get into it. So, of course, from Muhammad spawned these various Arab empires that then went on to conquer most of Spain and fight people in France and stuff like that. That did happen in the 700s. Then the caliphates in Spain were established and eventually broke ties from the ones back in North Africa and the Middle East because they had fundamental disagreements with them, so it became a separate kingdom. Just imagine your Christian kingdoms, right? And then what he also doesn't understand, and this goes back to, you know, the Muslims force converting people supposedly. The First Crusade was not a response to Arab Muslims. It was a response to the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Seljuk Turks came to Asia Minor from Asia itself, converted to Islam willingly. They didn't convert because they were conquered. They converted willingly, and then went about trying to conquer the region by fighting both Persian Shiites and Arab Sunni Muslims. And they did that because they were trying to conquer territory, and these groups did not consider the Turks real Muslims because they were not Arab. But these Turks also threatened the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople, so the emperor of that, Alexios I, asked Pope Urban II, can I have some knights to defend Constantinople? Pope Urban wanted to make amends with the Byzantines because the Catholic Church and the Eastern Church had only split about 30 odd years before. So on his way to France to start preaching stuff, he came up with an idea, basically, and there's various accounts of his speech where he made this into a holy war and a crusade. It wasn't a response to some events in France and Spain. It wasn't a response to any of that stuff. It was just an opportunist moment because the Seljuks were threatening the Byzantines, and he saw this alliance as a way to stage a war to claim Christian control of Jerusalem. So to even paint Islam as a monolith in this period is ridiculous. And then the Crusaders actually often allied with different Muslim groups to fight the Turks. They allied with Iraqi Muslims. They allied with Egyptian Shiites and stuff to fight the Turks. So to paint Islam as a unified monolith in this period is totally ridiculous because these Muslim kingdoms, just like the Christian kingdoms, were all fighting each other for territory and control. It wasn't like some mass movement like it was back in the 700s. And I need to remind you that the First Crusade starts in 1095. This is hundreds and hundreds of years after the invasion of Spain and after the founding of Islam. So in my mind, Sam Harris has a massive blind spot in his so-called, intelligence that he does not know the history of Spain and the history of Islam in Spain and the history of Christianity in Spain, because a lot of the history of Spain directly contradicts both his points on Christianity and Islam. Obviously, Cenk doesn't seem to know this either. Not everyone can know everything, but I feel like that is a point to bring up because he's saying that how Islam is spread by conquest, it's a response to this aggression, and we can see through the geopolitics of the time that Islam is often spread through other means, and Islam was not a monolith, and Islam did not have a unified goal of just spreading itself everywhere. I think people often get confused by this period with the various Arab and Persian and other types of Muslim groups and their empires with the Ottoman Empire, which was a massive unified group where it had a caliph, which these people thought was like the holy figure in Islam. This isn't this period. And the Seljuk Turks are not even the Ottoman Turks, they're different groups. So I love religious history, but it's clear Sam Harris paints in broad strokes and probably hasn't actually read much about the history of the Crusades and lives in a bit of a theoretical world where this nuance doesn't exist. So this is why I agree more with Cenk in the whole context of this debate, because he talks about geopolitical factors being really influential to all this stuff. Now, that gets to my final little segment I want to talk about. Is very relevant segment is where Sam Harris talks about Israel. Now, just before I recorded, I went on his Twitter to see what he was talking about lately. He basically shared a blog post from 7 years ago. He basically thinks Israel as a state shouldn't exist in terms of being founded on religion, but he does think there's an argument to be made it should exist as a response to how the Jews suffered in World War II. And basically, you'll see this, exchange by him and Cenk. He says that the Israelis' religion means that they will not kill all the Arabs, the Palestinians, all these groups in the region, where if we flip the switch and the Palestinians had control of this territory and the Jews were the powerless people here, that the Palestinians would probably kill them all.
It is because when you turn to the Palestinian issue, right, which you've written about,
right.
and you use that same exact way of thinking, you say, well, if the Israelis could do whatever they want to the Palestinians, we know what they would do because they're doing it right now, and we know if the Palestinians had it their way, they would wipe out all of the Jews. That's actually, I don't think that's true at all. I don't think it's remotely true. Okay, so, and I'll tell you.
But you're doing some mind reading, right? So you're in the telepathy
but so
business.
Are you.
No. They're telling us that they would wipe out everyone. So
No. So Sam, two things that are important there. Number one, Muslims had all the opportunity.
I'm talking about Hamas in particular.
Right. So, well, okay, then that's a slightly different conversation. But okay, look, Muslims did have all the opportunity in the world to kill all the Jews when they were in charge in the Middle East, and they didn't, right? So it is not necessarily because of Islam. It's the political situation they find themselves in and the frustration. Go on, why is that?
I've explained why they didn't kill all the Jews and all the Christians because of the doctrine of Dimitude.
Okay, then because of that same doctrine, why the Palestinians wouldn't kill all the Jews?
Again, I'm talking about Hamas, the democratically elected government in Gaza, right? So there are many Palestinians who agree with Hamas, clearly. Hamas, the state in the charter of Hamas, genocide is explicit, right?
Sam, everybody fighting under those circumstances which says I'm going to kill them all. But when the Muslims were in charge, they didn't kill them all. And by the way, so now we get to again the core of the issue, which is that you say if the Israelis could do anything they want, well, they wouldn't do. But well, wait a minute. Now they can do anything they want, and they occupy them, right? And so. And they prevent a state from happening. Then you turn around and you say, well, the Palestinians are really bad because if they could do anything they want, they would prevent Israel from being a state. But that's theoretical. What Israel's doing is real. They are already preventing the Palestinians from having a state.
When people, groups like Hamas, and even the Palestinians more generally, say to themselves, when they're talking just to themselves about the Jews, when they're creating children's programs for their kids about the Jews, right? And genocide runs straight through it, right? So the aspirations of...
You really don't believe that there's an enormous geopolitical reason behind that? The occupation, the crushing existence of the occupation is what's leading to that horrible ideology?
It's not. No, it's not. But what occupation led to the genocidal intentions of the Nazis?
No, so there could be two different reasons. Actually, there could be many different reasons why you go to genocidal intentions. But in all of those cases, it's not the religion alone that determines it. Religion is a factor, and I would say in the case of the Palestinians, a small factor. That in fact, if they had the power, my guess is as human beings, they would react very similar to the Jews and the Israelis, not in the good and the bad. I don't think they'd kill all the Jews because you have to flip the situation completely, the context completely. On the other hand, would they also subjugate and occupy the Jews? I bet they would because they're human beings, and that's apparently how human beings react.
Again, we're talking about the weighting of various factors, because of course the occupation is a factor, right? Now the occupation is not a factor that explains most of the other instances of suicidal violence and theocratic violence we see in the Muslim world. The occupation of the Palestinian territories has nothing to do with the reasons why a Sunni in Pakistan is going to wake up tomorrow morning and sacrifice his life to kill a Shia wedding party.
Yeah, no,
right?
Sam, I believe that we are way underestimating, and many people disagree with me, and you're, of course, free to disagree with me, but I think we are way underestimating the impact of the occupation for the whole Muslim world. That it is driving the Pakistani,
Sunni,
to be more
Ahmadi,
fundamentalist. No, but
violence
what's
in
interesting
Pakistan?
and perhaps ironic is that it might be driving the Sunni and the Shia to be more fundamentalist, and in that fundamentalism, they then fight each other, which is not the only reason why they fight each other, but it makes that fight worse.
But again, fundamentalism is only a problem if the fundamentals are a problem, right? You've got Christians in many of these Muslim communities that are being mistreated by the West, or being mistreated by the Israelis, or just living in very unlucky circumstances. You have Christian communities. You have Iraqi Christians, or you used to until they started getting killed and pushed out. You have Lebanese Christians. You have Christians in the West Bank and Gaza, presumably. Where are the Christian suicide bombers? People living in the same kinds of conditions, right? I mean, the Christian Palestinians have to go through the same checkpoints as Muslim Palestinians, right, in Israel.
Well, I have an answer.
Now, what is fascinating about this exchange is that Sam Harris really downplays how much the occupation of Palestine plays into the Palestinians' own actions and all this stuff. He basically tries to say, well, Hamas, look at Hamas, Islamic extremists, a lot of Palestinians support them, and because Hamas are outwardly very violent, talk about killing all the Israelis and stuff, that shows that this Islamic ideology is more prone to this stuff, right? And basically he's saying because a lot of Palestinians back them, it shows that it's mainly an Islamic issue. And he likes to mention Palestinian Christians. He's like, why aren't Palestinian Christians doing these terrorist attacks? And he talks about the Palestinian elections, like back in the day. Palestinian Christians did vote for Hamas. And I spoke about in my live stream and my videos, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's more outwardly extremist and militant. But what the Muslim Brotherhood always do is community work and embed themselves in communities. That's why they got so popular during the Egyptian revolution as well. And what happened is that they felt like the PLO and Arafat and the Fatah party had sold the Palestinians out to the West and to Israel. Hamas seemed like they're the only ones who would stand up to them. That's why you get Palestinian Christians voting for Islamic extremists. It's not because these Christians suddenly like terrorism and Islamic extremism. It's geopolitical factors which Sam Harris likes to completely ignore. But in the whole conversation, he talks about groups like Al-Qaeda, for example, and he says, Al-Qaeda are just solely motivated by a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And it's hard to dispute that in a lot of their actions they are, but Cenk brings up a really good point, and this is why I feel like he does better in the debate. He says, even with that, you are totally downplaying how much the occupation of Palestinians is central to many of these Islamic groups. Al-Qaeda is primarily founded as a response to the First Gulf War, where US troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia. It's also a response to what Israel have historically done to Palestine. Of course, it's motivated by how much Jerusalem is a holy site in Islam, but the geopolitical factors help inspire these militants. And it really is a key issue in the Islamic world. Like, Iran and Al-Qaeda hate each other. They fought each other. They both agree on one thing. They both agree about the Palestinians, though, and that's why Iran, even though it is Shia, has often funded Hamas throughout its history. And of course, Iran is behind the creation of Hezbollah. And reading Sam Harris's stuff at the moment, yes, what groups like Hamas say about Jewish people is totally awful. What they say they're going to do to the Jews and do to Israelis is awful. No one can endorse that stuff. And of course, it also has some basis in Islam with Muhammad's own confrontation with Jewish people in his life. But to say that Hamas itself is just really inspired by Islamic extremism and not a reaction to what has gone on in Palestine. This is why Palestinians voted for them. It's not because they're all extremists. Palestinians historically have been a more secular group of Muslims. And in fact, they still are in places like the West Bank. But like many of these groups, it is a response to occupation. And Cenk likes to compare them with the IRA. And the IRA's Catholicism, I don't think that's a great example because as someone with an Irish Catholic background, most Irish people aren't fanatical Christians. and the whole war with Northern Ireland isn't really about being Catholic and Protestant. It's mainly about Protestantism being the religion of the Scots and the English who settled Ireland and would not give that back, where most native Irish are Catholics. So it's more like an identity thing, a sectarian thing, rather than these guys hating each other based on the Pope versus, you know, the monarch, the Queen of England, who's the head of the Church of England. But it's really not the most relevant thing. And I feel that is the same with Hamas and the Israelis. Because yes, they do have this Islamic extremist ideology, but this group exists in this context because of geopolitical factors. Something Sam Harris does not like to admit. Now, I haven't gone into this as much, but throughout the debate, they're debating ideology and how basically Sam Harris seems to like to generalize Muslims and stuff. And in this debate, actually, Sam Harris tries to downplay it quite well, but his Western chauvinism does still come through, talking about, like, we need to, you know, reform Islam, we need to reform all these people, help them see a better ideology. But again, like with Sam Harris's historical analysis, something he always lacks is political analysis. These countries where Islamic extremism thrives have one or two things going for them. Either they are isolated by the West and they're hostile to the West as a response to what the West have done for them, or they are propped up by the West. Case in point, Iran. Iran wasn't always this country ruled by Islamic fundamentalists. You guys know this. It used to be ruled by the Shah. It was more secular, but even before it became this dictatorship after the coup, it was ruled by a parliament under the Shah. A parliament that had many different groups. There were communist parties in Iran. There were fascist parties in Iran. There were many parties in Iran who didn't even like Islam. But because of the coup, because of the Shah's actions, because of Khomeini being the most prominent critic, Islamists were able to hijack a very, you know, multi-political revolution and install themselves as the leader, not helped by Saddam Hussein invaded them straight away, which made most Iranians rally around the new government. And that has affected so much in the region, from Syria to Afghanistan to Lebanon, even in Palestine. But that is a geopolitical reaction to this stuff. And then you take other countries like Saudi Arabia. These guys talk about it. Saudi Arabia is allowed to spread Islamic extremism because it's been in bed with the US since like the 1930s. And it's a key client of the US. Also sells them a lot of oil as well and is one of their main allies. Now, Arabia was conquered by the Al Saud royal family, backed by this priest. I think his name was Al bin Wahhab. That is how the Wahhabism stuff is founded in Saudi Arabia. But again, it's allowed to exist because the US backs them up. And that is the same throughout the region. So for example, Egypt's government has stayed more secular because Sisi is backed by the US, and when the army ousted Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood and got rid of an Islamic party being the rulers of Egypt, that is backed by the US. All these, you know, North African countries that are more secular are propped up by the US, but they're dictatorships. But while they're more secular, they are still more conservative with rules against people like atheists and the LGBT community. And the reason Egyptians and other North Africans and Arabs and, you know, all this stuff, the reason they can't often make progress on these things is that because they're ruled by dictators where they can't change much of anything. And they're backed by the West. And the West are not going to let the Egyptian army be replaced by someone like Morsi, are they? And to Sam Harris, the differences with the West and Christianity, for the most part, and the Islamic world and Islam is just because of the doctrine. And in my mind, it's because of geopolitical factors. It's about socio-economic factors and mainly a response to imperialism that gives a lot of these ideologies legitimacy in the eyes of the people who follow them. But I've played many clips about Sam Harris talking about how Islamic refugees are bad to Western countries because it's going to cause the death of Europe. Lovely stuff there he's been saying. And just his outward racism I've talked about in many videos lately. So I feel Cenk's been vindicated, and I feel as maybe sloppily as he did it, and maybe not the best person to debate this with, I think the points about geopolitics are spot on. And I think Sam Harris both lacks historical understanding and he lacks political analysis. This is the same guy who back in 2015 was very opposed to Black Lives Matter. This is the guy who even recently as last year was talking about how racism isn't a motivator for police to commit acts of violence against minorities. So to conclude the video, 6.5 years later, I feel like Cenk has been vindicated more, Sam Harris less. And even though all the YouTube comments are still like, this is what like a total KO looks like on Cenk, like massive smackdown, he can't handle how intelligent Sam Harris is, it's clear a lot of the people who follow Sam Harris don't really know this stuff either. Because if they were truly like big brain intellectuals, they could see right through some of Sam Harris's arguments. And it's clear, like many new atheists and the new atheist movement in general, they see Islam as a unique threat in terms of religion compared to all the other religions. Not that we just had Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration actively, pursuing Armageddon. Not that we have white evangelical Christians being one of the most powerful group in America who all want this stuff as well. Not that we have the rise of Christian far-right nationalism in Russia, Poland, Hungary, all these countries that are going to complete shit because of this stuff. And we have it in the US as well, and to a lesser extent, the UK. And Sam Harris says, if it changed, if Christianity became more of a threat and stuff, then I would change my focus. But he really hasn't changed his focus. But anyway, if there's any parts of this you want me to cover further, I could do a part 2. Not sure if we really need to do a part 2 though, but go watch it for yourself if you haven't, just to, have some nostalgia about 2014 and for me being a young person, maybe being a bit naive as well. And seeing it with new eyes, I guess, is always a good thing. Maybe I'll do another one of these videos like that Jordan Peterson interview where he, owned that feminist. Maybe I'll have a look at that from a couple years ago for my next one. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Subscribe if you're new, like the video. Please go show support for our sponsor. Very nice of them for sponsoring me. As you know, being a political commentator, it's quite hard to make money on YouTube because a lot of your stuff gets demonetized. So massive thanks to them for sponsoring this video. If you want to support me on Patreon, check out my Patreon. Second channel, also in the description. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.